The whiskey bottle shattered against the wall, showering the peeling floral wallpaper in amber liquid and glass shards. One jagged piece nicked my ear, but I didn't flinch. I couldn't afford to. Across the living room, Hank swayed, his face flushed a deep, violent crimson, muttering curses at a ghost that wasn't there. This wasn't just a bad night. It was the final act of a long, miserable play. For years, I hadn't been a son or even a ward to Hank. I was unpaid labor, a tool he used until the edges dulled. He'd spend his days drowning in cheap bourbon while I was out in the humidity of the Louisiana bayou, turning wrenches on rusted-out engines or hauling scrap metal until my hands bled. Hank had been a mechanic once before the bottle took over, and he'd beaten the trade into me with a heavy hand and a short temper. To him, books were a threat, something that gave people ideas above their station. My station, in his eyes, was under the hood of a car or face down in the dirt. He finally slumped onto the stained recliner, the leather groaning under his weight, and within seconds, his heavy, raspy snoring filled the trailer. I didn't hesitate. I'd practiced this moment in my head 1,000 times. I grabbed my backpack from under the bed. It was a survival kit born from desperation, packed with essentials I'd scavenged or shoplifted. A flashlight with dying batteries, 2 packs of beef jerky from the gas and go, a Swiss Army knife with a broken tip, and the only picture I had left of my mom. The photo was bent at the edges, but her smile was the only thing that felt real in this graveyard of a home. I shoved the window open. The humid air of the bayou rushed in, carrying the heavy scent of rain and swamp mud. I slipped through the frame, my sneakers hitting the wet grass with a soft thud. I didn't look back. I ran until my lungs burned, sticking to the shadows of the longleaf pines and avoiding the harsh glare of the streetlights. The interstate roared in the distance, a river of light and metal heading somewhere, anywhere but here. My plan was simple: get to the freight yards, catch a train, and disappear. But the Louisiana sky had other plans. It ripped open, unleashing a torrential downpour that turned the dirt roads into treacherous rivers of mud. I scrambled for shelter under the massive concrete arch of an old railway bridge, shivering and soaking wet. I backed into the darkest corner, clutching my broken knife only to trip over something warm. "Watch it, rookie," a voice hissed from the shadows. I jumped back, fumbling for my dying flashlight. The weak beam cut through the dark, revealing a girl about my age, maybe 13 or 14. She was huddled in an oversized army jacket, her tangled curls tucked under a beanie. She wasn't scared. She looked annoyed, casually eating beans straight from a can with a plastic spoon. I didn't know anyone was here," I stammered. "Well, now you do," she said, scraping the bottom of the tin. She eyed my backpack with the clinical gaze of someone who knew exactly what it was like to carry their entire life on their shoulders. "You running from the cops or a foster home?" "Stepdad," I said, the word tasting like bile. She nodded, her expression softening just a fraction. "I'm Valerie. Ran from a group home in Mobile 3 weeks ago." She tossed the empty can into a pile of trash. "You can't stay here, though. The sheriff's deputies patrol this underpass when the rain stops. They round up kids like stray dogs." The adrenaline was fading, replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion. I had escaped the trailer, but the world outside was just as cold. "Where do we go then?" I asked. Valerie stood up, slinging a canvas bag over her shoulder and pointing toward the dense, foreboding tree line of the Blackwood Reserve. "We go where they won't follow," she said, a strange glint in her eyes. "I saw something yesterday. Big stone. A castle." The idea was crazy. A castle in the middle of a Louisiana swamp. But the mention of Hank waking up was all the motivation I needed to follow her into the dark. The trek into the Blackwood Reserve felt less like a hike
and more like a descent into some forgotten prehistoric world. The rain had tapered off into a thick, suffocating mist that clung to the long-leaf pines like a ghostly shroud. Every step was a battle against the Louisiana mud, a thick, clay-heavy sludge that tried to suck the sneakers right off my feet. Valerie moved through the undergrowth with a reckless, practiced grace, her oversized army jacket snagging on briars that she ignored with a stoic silence. "Keep your eyes on the ridge," she whispered, her voice cutting through the eerie stillness of the woods. I didn't ask how she knew where she was going. In the world of runaways, you don't ask for credentials, you just look for the person who isn't shaking as hard as you are. My lungs burned, and the nick on my ear from Hank's whiskey bottle throbbed in time with my heartbeat. I was running on nothing but adrenaline and the lingering terror of that trailer, but as we crested a steep, vine-choked ridge, even that fear was eclipsed by what lay below. The clouds parted just enough for a sliver of moonlight to hit the valley. There, rising out of a sea of kudzu and cypress, was a nightmare of stone and shadow. It was a castle, a sprawling, crumbling Gothic beast that looked like it had been plucked from a Scottish moor and dropped into the humid heart of the South. It was a folly, a rich man's vanity project from the roaring 20s that had been left to rot when the money or the luck ran out. To the locals in town, it was just the haunted house on the hill, a place where teenagers went on dares and never stayed past midnight. "It's real," I breathed, the sight making me forget the bone-deep cold for a second. "It's better than real," Valerie countered, a small triumphant smile breaking through her exhaustion. "It's empty." The descent was a controlled fall. We slid down the muddy embankment, grabbing at wet roots and saplings that tore at our palms. Up close, the place was even more intimidating. The front doors were massive oak slabs, swollen shut by decades of swamp humidity and bound by an iron chain thick enough to anchor a battleship. "Dead end?" I asked, clicking on my flashlight. The beam flickered, the batteries dying a slow death. "There's no such thing as a dead end, Noah. Just lack of imagination," Valerie muttered. She pointed to a wisteria trellis on the east wing, the vines thick as a man's wrist and snaking up toward a second-story balcony where the stone railing had long since crumbled away. I watched, heart hammering, as she scaled the trellis with the agility of a stray cat. One slip meant a broken neck in a forest where no one would find us for years, but she didn't hesitate. She disappeared over the lip of the balcony, and for a long, terrifying minute, there was only the sound of the wind. Then a heavy thud echoed from inside, followed by the agonizing screech of metal on stone. A side door, hidden behind a mess of overgrown azalea bushes, groaned open. Valerie stood there in the dark, dusting off her hands, looking like the queen of a very broken kingdom. "Welcome home," she said. Stepping inside felt like being swallowed by a whale. The air was stale, heavy with the scent of dry rot, old paper, and a century of dust. It was a vacuum that killed the sound of the storm outside. My flashlight beam swept over a grand foyer where a staircase wide enough for 10 people curved into the darkness above, its red velvet runner moth-eaten and gray. A chandelier hung precariously from a ceiling draped in cobwebs, so thick they looked like ghostly shrouds. "Why would anyone leave this?" I stammered, feeling smaller than I ever had in Hank's trailer. "Taxes, bankruptcy, murder, pick your poison," Valerie said, her voice echoing off the marble floors. "Doesn't matter. Finders, keepers." We moved through the ground floor like ghosts exploring their own past. We found a library, with leather-bound books whose spines had cracked like old skin, and a dining room where the table was still set for a dinner party that never happened. But it was the kitchen that felt like a miracle. In the walk-in pantry, hidden behind a door that Valerie had to shoulder open, we found the supplies that would keep us alive. The rats had gotten the food decades ago, but in the back were boxes of candles, a rusted tin of kerosene, and stacks of old newspapers from 1954. We retreated to the library, the smallest and most human room we could find. We crumpled up the headlines of the Cold War and piled them into the massive fireplace, along with some broken chair legs. When the fire finally caught, the relief was physical. The orange light danced against the walls of books, chasing the shadows back into the corners. I sank onto a dusty rug, the warmth seeping into my damp clothes. For the first time since I'd climbed out that trailer window, the tension in my shoulders unspooled. Valerie sat opposite me, splitting one of my shoplifted beef jerky packs with her Swiss Army knife.
"So," she said, chewing thoughtfully. "Noah, that's a biblical name. Building an ark?" "Something like that," I muttered, just trying to stay afloat.
We sat in silence, the fire popping, and the old house settling around us with groans and creaks. Outside, the world of angry stepfathers and social workers still existed, but here, behind 3 feet of stone, it felt a million miles away.
"We need to secure the perimeter tomorrow," Valerie said, her eyelids finally drooping. "Check the entrances. Find water. I saw a well in the courtyard," I remembered. "If I can find some tools, I can probably get it working."
"We'll find 'em," she murmured, curling up on the rug. "We'll build it all."
As the fire died down to embers, I looked up at the high ceiling. Through a gap in the heavy curtains, I saw a single star winking in the clearing sky. It felt like a promise. The house was breathing, and for the first time in my life, I realized I was breathing too. We weren't just 2 runaways anymore. We were the owners of the Blackwood estate. Morning hit us like a hangover. Not the kind Hank used to nurse, shaking and sweating on the linoleum floor, but a clean, sharp ache in the bones that came from sleeping on a hardwood floor with nothing but a moth-eaten rug for a mattress. Sunlight was screaming through the cracks in the boarded-up windows, turning the dancing dust motes into columns of gold. For a split second, I forgot I'd jumped out of a trailer window. I expected the smell of stale Budweiser and the roar of the morning news. Instead, I smelled cedar, old paper, and damp earth. "Rise and shine, sunshine," Valerie's voice croaked from the other side of the library. She was stretching, her joints popping like bubble wrap. "We got work to do. What time is it?" I rubbed the grit from my eyes. "Time to not die," she replied, shaking out that oversized army jacket. "Rule number 1 of the streets, secure your water. Rule number 2, secure your perimeter. We're doing both." We polished off the last of the beef jerky for breakfast, a pathetic meal that did 0 to stop the hollow drumming in my stomach. The hunger was a dull throb now, a reminder that the romanticized into the wild phase of running away was officially over. Now the survival phase began. We stepped out into the courtyard, and in the harsh daylight, our castle looked less like a monster and more like a tragic victim. The stone walls were scarred with moss, and the ivy acted like a tourniquet, the only thing holding the crumbling masonry together. The courtyard was a jungle of overgrown azaleas and weeds that reached my waist. "The well," I said, pointing to a circular stone structure nearly swallowed by brambles. It took us 20 minutes of hacking with a rusted garden shear Valerie found just to reach it. The well was covered by a wooden lid so bloated with rot It looked like a giant fungus. On three, I grunted, digging my fingers under the lip. 1, 2, 3. We heaved. The wood groaned and slid off with a sickening squelch, releasing a cool, mineral scent from the deep. I dropped a rock. 1, 2, splash. It's deep, Valerie said, peering over the edge. But there's water. The bucket mechanism, however, was a rusted tragedy. The iron crank was seized tight. But this was my territory. Hank had been a decent mechanic before the bottle took his soul, and he'd beaten enough knowledge of leverage and grease into me to make me useful. I need oil, I muttered, examining the gears, and a hammer. We trekked to a leaning shed near the tree line, a graveyard for forgotten suburbia. Inside were rusted paint cans, 70s-era license plates, and a workbench cluttered with the ghosts of chores past. I found a ball-peen hammer and a can of WD-40 that felt half full. It was like finding a brick of gold bullion. Back at the well, I went to work. I sprayed the gears, the chemical scent of the lubricant sharp against the organic smell of the swamp. I tapped the rust with the hammer, gently at first, then harder, trying to break the seal of oxidation. Clang, clang, clang. Come on, I whispered, don't be stubborn. I gave the crank a hard shove. It screeched like a dying banshee. But it moved. An inch. Then 2. You're a wizard, Noah. Valerie grinned, her face smudged with dirt. We winched up a bucket of water that was clear, cold, and sweet. We didn't have a way to boil it yet, so we took the risk. I drank from my cupped hands, and it was better than any soda from a 7-Eleven. It tasted like life. With water secured, the dynamic shifted. We weren't just squatters anymore. We were residents. We spent the afternoon colonizing the library. We dragged down the heavy velvet curtains to let the light in, beating the dust out of them until we nearly choked. We scavenged cushions from other rooms to create a makeshift nest in front of the fireplace. Valerie took charge of interior design, finding a chipped ceramic bowl and filling it with wildflowers from the courtyard. It makes it look lived in, she said, stepping back. If it looks like a home, maybe the universe will let it be one. I was busy securing the doors. I found some 2x4s in the shed and fashioned drop bar locks for the main entrances. I checked the windows, nailing shut the loose ones. Every nail I drove felt like a declaration. This is ours. You can't come in. By late afternoon, the sun began to dip, casting long, melancholy shadows across the grounds. We were exhausted, our hands raw, but there was a satisfaction in this fatigue I'd never felt doing chores for Hank. That was slavery. This was building. Hey, Valerie called from the top of the grand staircase. You need to see this. I climbed up, the stairs groaning under my sneakers. She was standing in a hallway we hadn't explored yet, pointing at a door slightly ajar. I pushed it open. It was a nursery. Unlike the rest of the house, this room seemed preserved in a bubble. The wallpaper was yellow with peeling ducks and sailboats. A wooden rocking horse stood in the corner and alphabet blocks were scattered on the floor. I picked up a block. Who lived here? A family, Valerie said softly, pulling a copy of The Velveteen Rabbit from a shelf. A family that left in a hurry. She sat on the floor looking small, younger than 14. The toughness she wore like armor melted away. I never had a room like this, she said. I shared a room with 3 other girls at the foster home. We had lockers, like in gym class. I had a closet, I admitted, sitting opposite her. Before Mom died, we lived in a trailer park. I slept on a pile of laundry. Valerie looked at me, her eyes shimmering. We're a pair of sad sacks, aren't we? Maybe, I said, spinning the wheel of a toy truck between us. But we got a castle now, and a library, and a well. And a rocking horse, she added, winding up a tin music box on the shelf. It let out a tinny, halting melody. Pop Goes the Weasel. It sounded eerie in the quiet house, but also defiant. We need a flag, I said suddenly. A what? A flag to claim the territory. We spent the last hour of daylight on the roof of the turret. The view was breathtaking. A green ocean of forest, rolling to a purple horizon. We tied an old red tablecloth to a lightning rod. On it we'd painted a simple house with a tree inside it. The order of the castle, Valerie proclaimed, saluting as the wind whipped her hair. Long may we reign, I said. As we stood there, I felt invincible. We had water, shelter, and each other. The world of angry stepfathers and social workers felt 1,000,000 miles away. But as the sun slipped below the tree line, I saw it. Far off, on the old logging road, a glint of light flashed. Then another. It wasn't a firefly, it was too steady, too harsh. High beams, a truck was coming. My stomach dropped. The invincibility shattered like that whiskey bottle against the wall. Val, I said, my voice tight. I see it, she whispered, her grip on my arm hard enough to bruise. They're coming. The headlights swept across the library walls like prison searchlights, slicing through the dust motes and illuminating our panicked faces. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird as the invincibility I'd felt on the roof vanished into the damp, stale air of the foyer. I dove for the fireplace, smothering the dying embers with a heavy wool blanket to plunge the room into suffocating darkness. Stay down, Valerie hissed, her grip on my arm tight enough to cut off circulation. We heard the crunch of gravel as the truck rolled to a stop right in front of the main entrance, followed by the heavy thud-thud of car doors slamming. Voices drifted up, rough, deep, and distinctly unhappy. I told you it was far out, Earl. Look at this pile of junk, one voice boomed. Junk? You kidding me? That's copper wiring, lead piping, maybe even some old fixtures. This place is a gold mine, heavy on the mine, the other replied. Scrappers. I knew the type all too well. Hank used to sell stolen catalytic converters to guys like this, men who looked at the world and saw only what they could break down and sell by the pound. They weren't here to admire the architecture or the wildflowers Valerie had tucked into a chipped bowl. They were here to gut our home. A beam of a high-powered flashlight cut through the boarded-up window of the foyer. Then came the screech of metal on wood, a crowbar prying at the front doors I'd worked so hard to secure. They're going to break it, I whispered, a surge of irrational protectiveness rising in my chest. It wasn't just stone and rot anymore. It was the first place I'd ever felt like I belonged. Not if we spook 'em, Valerie whispered back, her fear gone, replaced by a cold, calculating intensity. This is our turf, Noah. We know the layout. They don't. What do we do? I asked. Psychological warfare, she grinned in the dark, her eyes hard like flint. You take the servants' passage behind the kitchen. I'll take the balcony, make noise, be a ghost. The front doors gave way with a splintering crash that echoed through the hollow house. Heavy boots stomped onto the marble floor of the foyer. Hello? A voice boomed. Anyone home? Raccoons? Hobos? I slipped into the narrow gap behind the library bookshelf that led to the servants' corridors. It was tight, smelling of dry rot and mice, but it moved me unseen to the kitchen. Through a crack in the swinging door, I saw them, 2 men in grease-stained coveralls. One was huge, with a beard like steel wool. The other was wiry and twitchy, holding a long iron crowbar. They started ripping at the wall sconces, careless of the plaster crumbling around them. Easy money, the wiry one laughed. A flash of anger surprised me. I grabbed a heavy cast iron skillet from the counter, one of the few things left behind in the industrial kitchen. I didn't want to hurt them. I just wanted them out of our kingdom. I waited until they moved toward the dining room, then I hurled the skillet across the kitchen. It crashed into a stack of metal trays with a sound like a bomb going off. Clang crash! The men jumped, spinning around wildly with their lights. What the hell was that? The big one barked. I thought you said nobody was here, Earl? Probably a rat, a big one. Earl tried to reason, though his voice wavered. From the floor above, a low, mournful wail began to drift down. Valerie was using a rusted heating pipe, like a trumpet, distorting her voice into a hollow, ghostly moan that seemed to come from the very walls themselves. Chateau. The wiry man took a step back, his flashlight trembling. Did you hear that? It's the wind, you idiot, Earl growled, though he marched toward the stairs with a false bravado. I ain't scared of no ghost. I scrambled up the back stairs, my sneakers silent on the wood, and beat them to the landing. As Earl started climbing the main staircase, I found the bag of marbles we had discovered in the nursery earlier. It was a classic gag. Something out of a Saturday morning cartoon, but we were desperate. I scattered them across the top landing just as his head appeared over the rail. Earl took the final step, his heavy boot landing on a glass sphere. His leg flew out from under him. He went down hard, sliding 3 steps back down with a string of curses that would have made a sailor blush. My back, you little punks, he roared, the illusion of ghosts shattered. I see you up there. The game had changed? They knew we were real? The wiry man charged up past his fallen partner, swinging the crowbar with genuine malice. Panic seized me. I retreated into the library, but he was fast. He kicked the door open just as Valerie dropped from the balcony onto the windowsill. Get away from him, she screamed, throwing a heavy hardcover book that caught him in the shoulder. He barely flinched. You brats think this is funny? The wiry man sneered, cornering me against the fireplace. The beam of his flashlight blinded me. You think you can just squat in private property and assault people? You're trespassing, I shouted, my voice cracking. This is our house. This is a tear-down kid. He lunged, grabbing the collar of my shirt. He smelled of stale tobacco and sweat, and for a second I was back in the trailer with Hank. The helplessness, the fear, it all came rushing back. But I wasn't that kid anymore. I had climbed a mountain, fixed a well, and built a home. I didn't freeze. I twisted, reaching for the fireplace poker I had left, leaning against the mantel. My fingers closed around the cold iron. Let go, I growled. I swung the poker, not at his head but hard against the metal crowbar in his hand. The vibration rang out, jarring his arm. Clang! Ow! He dropped the bar, loosening his grip. Valerie didn't hesitate. She leapt from the windowsill, landing on his back like a wild cat, scratching and pulling at his hair. Leave him alone, she screamed. The man stumbled, flailing to shake her off, as Earl, limping and red-faced, appeared in the doorway. But Earl stopped. He looked at me standing with the poker raised, chest heaving. He looked at Valerie, fierce and unyielding, and then he looked around the room. He saw the swept floor, the fresh wildflowers, and our red tablecloth, flag drying on the rack. We weren't just vandalism, we were desperate. Come on, Ricky, Earl said, his voice surprisingly quiet. What? They attacked me, Ricky sputtered. They're kids, Ricky. Look at 'em. Earl gestured vaguely. And the cops patrol this area. Too much noise. It ain't worth the jail time for assault on a minor. Ricky glared at us, rubbing his arm, then spat on the floor. Freaks. Let's go, Earl grunted. This place is haunted anyway, haunted by bad luck. We didn't move until we heard the truck engine roar to life and the tires spray gravel as they sped away. The red taillights faded into the forest, leaving us in a silence that felt heavier than before. I dropped the poker, my hands shaking so hard I couldn't make a fist. Valerie slid off the sofa and sat on the floor, pulling her knees to her chest. She wasn't laughing about the marbles. "They know," she whispered. "They're gone, but they'll talk. Scrappers talk, or they'll come back with more guys." I sat beside her, the adrenaline crashing and leaving me hollow. We had won the battle, but the illusion of safety was shattered. "We held the fort," I said, trying to sound brave. "For tonight," Valerie said, resting her head on my shoulder. "But the world is coming for us, Noah. We can't board up the windows against the whole world." I looked at the window where the moonlight was filtering back in. The storm had fully passed, leaving the sky clear. "Then we don't hide," I said, a new resolve settling in my gut. "We stopped running when we got here, Val. I'm not running again." "So what do we do?" "We wait for morning," I said, watching the first hint of gray touch the eastern sky. "And we face whatever comes." Standing up, the sunrise didn't bring the warmth we expected. Instead, it brought the flashing blue lights of a sheriff's cruiser silently rolling up the long gravel driveway. There were no sirens, just the crunch of tires on stone and the rhythmic strobe of red and blue bouncing off the castle walls. Valerie and I stood on the front porch. We hadn't slept. We had spent the last few hours sweeping the foyer, straightening the rug, and making sure our home looked less like a squat and more like a sanctuary. We weren't going to be dragged out like rats. We were going to walk out like the owners we felt we were. "You ready?" Valerie asked, her voice steady, though I saw her knuckles turning white as she gripped the railing. "Ready," I lied. The cruiser door opened, and a deputy stepped out. He was an older man, shaped like a linebacker, who had gone to seed with a coffee stain on his uniform and a weary look in his eyes. He didn't unholster his gun, he just adjusted his hat and looked up at the towering, ivy-choked facade. "Quite a clubhouse you kids got here," he called out, his voice carrying over the morning mist. "It's not a clubhouse," I shouted back, my voice cracking slightly. "It's a residence." The deputy chuckled, a low, gravelly sound. He walked up the steps slowly, his boots thudding on the wood. "I got a call from a couple of concerned citizens. Said there were wild animals living in the old Blackwood estate. You two don't look like raccoons." "We're not animals." Valerie stepped forward, her chin high. "And we're not going back." The deputy stopped a few feet from us. He looked at our clothes, worn, dirty, but mended. He looked at the clean porch. He looked at the red tablecloth flag flapping defiantly from the turret. His eyes softened. In small-town Louisiana, cops knew the frequent flyers. He likely knew who Hank was, and he definitely knew about the foster system. "I can't let you stay here, son," he said gently. "Structural instability. No running water. It's a liability nightmare. The state would have my badge." "We fixed the well," I blurted out, "and we boarded the windows. We're fixing it." Before he could answer, another car pulled up, a beige sedan. My heart sank. Child Protective Services. The ultimate boogeyman for kids like us. A woman with a clipboard stepped out, looking at the castle with a mixture of horror and awe. But then, a third car arrived. It was an old station wagon rattling and coughing smoke. An elderly woman stepped out, leaning heavily on a cane. I recognized her from the pictures in the library. She looked like the older version of the little girl in the oil paintings. "Mrs. Higgins?" the deputy asked, surprised. "I thought you were in the nursing home in Baton Rouge." "I heard my house was being lived in," she croaked, her voice sharp as broken glass. She hobbled up the steps, ignoring the deputy and the social worker, and stopped right in front of me. She peered at me with cloudy blue eyes. "You the one who fixed the well crank?" "Yes, ma'am," I whispered. "And you," she turned to Valerie, "you planted those wildflowers in the foyer?" "Yes, ma'am," Valerie said. "It needed color." The old woman looked at the castle, her childhood home that had been left to rot for 40 years. She saw the boarded windows, the swept floors, the desperate, beautiful attempt 2 throwaway kids had made to build a life out of her wreckage. She turned to the deputy. "They aren't trespassing, Sheriff Miller. They are my caretakers." The silence that followed was louder than the storm. "Ma'am, they are minors," the social worker interjected, stepping up. "They are runaways. We have reports of—" "I know what you have reports of," Mrs. Higgins snapped. "I know this boy's stepfather, and I know the group home system is a pipeline to prison." She looked back at us, her expression softening. "I can't live here anymore. Too many stairs, but I can't let it die either. These 2, they breathed life into it. It wasn't a fairy tale ending where we got to live in the castle alone forever. The law doesn't work like that. But it was something better. It was a chance. The negotiations took hours. In the end, a deal was struck that the whole town talked about for years. Mrs. Higgins set up a trust. The Blackwood estate was to be renovated as a community center for at-risk youth, a place for kids who, like us, had fallen through the cracks. Valerie and I weren't sent back. I was placed with a foster family in town, the Millers, actually. The sheriff and his wife had an empty room and a lot of patience. Valerie went to a specialized program just 2 towns over, not a warehouse for kids, but a real home. But every weekend we went back to the castle. We didn't have to break in anymore. We had keys. 6 months later, I stood on the roof of the turret again. The scaffolding was up, and the smell of fresh paint replaced the smell of rot. Valerie climbed up beside me. She looked different, cleaner, healthier, but she still wore that oversized army jacket. "We did it," she said, looking out over the forest. The scary, dark woods didn't look so frightening anymore. They looked like a backyard. "We didn't just build a shelter, Val," I said, looking at our tattered flag. "We built a way out." She bumped my shoulder with hers. "We built a home, Noah. And the best part, it has an open-door policy." We stood there, the king and queen of the Blackwood estate, watching the sunset not as an ending, but as a promise of tomorrow. We found a tribe, and it all started with a broken window, a storm, and the courage to stop running. 1 year has passed since the flashing blue lights of Sheriff Miller's cruiser changed the trajectory of our lives. Today, the Blackwood estate doesn't look like a beast or a haunted house anymore. The scaffolding is gone. The gray stone has been scrubbed clean of a century's worth of grime, and the ivy, while still there, is now a manicured frame rather than a suffocating tourniquet. It was the official opening of the Blackwood Youth Center. The lawn, once a jungle of waist-high weeds and hidden copper scrappers, was now covered in picnic blankets and the sound of laughter. I stood on the porch, wearing a clean button-down shirt that felt a bit stiff, but for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like I was wearing a disguise. Living with the Millers had been an adjustment. For the first few months, I still slept with my shoes on, ready to jump out the window at the first sign of a raised voice. But the raised voices never came. Instead, there were Sunday dinners, help with my algebra homework, and a garage where the sheriff let me work on an old '67 Mustang. I wasn't a tool anymore. I was a kid learning a craft. Valerie was there too, leaning against the railing with that same defiant spark in her eyes. She'd thrived in her program, showing a knack for organization that would probably lead to her running a Fortune 500 company one day. She still wore her oversized army jacket over her dress, a stubborn reminder of where she'd been. Mrs. Higgins sat in a chair of honor, watching the kids run through the grand foyer we had once swept in the dark. She caught my eye and gave a small, sharp nod, the kind of look that said, "We did good, kid." "Thinking about the marbles?" Valerie asked, bumping my shoulder. "Thinking about the skillet," I laughed, "and how close we came to losing it all." "We didn't lose," she said, looking up at the turret. The original red tablecloth flag was gone, replaced by a professional banner for the center, but the old tattered cloth was framed in the library downstairs. We just traded a kingdom of ruins for a community of people. The open door policy was real. There were 10 kids living in the residential wing now, kids who had stories just like ours. They didn't look at the house with fear. They looked at it with the same awe I felt that first night in the storm. They were learning that a home isn't a place you're born into. It's a place you fight for, a place you build with the people who refuse to let you fall. As the sun began to set, casting that familiar purple and orange glow over the Louisiana woods, I realized the boy who jumped out of that trailer window was finally gone. In his place was someone who knew that even a shattered life can be pieced back together, provided you have the right tools and a tribe to hold the light. The Blackwood estate wasn't just a building anymore. It was a promise that no matter how hard the storm hits, there's always a way to find your way home.